for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about an urgent cry for help brings Poirot to France. When Hercule Poirot and his associate Arthur Hastings arrive in the French village of Merlinville-sur-Mer to meet their client Paul Renauld, they learn from the police that he has been found that morning stabbed in the back with a letter opener and left in a newly dug grave adjacent to a local golf course. Among the plausible suspects are Renaud's wife Eloise, his son Jack, and the mysterious Cinderella of Hastings' recent acquaintance. Poirot's powers of investigation ultimately triumph over the wiles of an assailant whose misdirection and motives are nearly but not quite impossible to spot. "That is a splendid specimen there," said Poirot, pointing. "Might I perhaps have a cutting of it?" "But certainly, monsieur." The old fellow stepped into the bed, and carefully took a slip from the plant Poirot had admired. Poirot was profuse in his thanks, and Auguste departed to his barrow. "You see?" said Poirot with a smile, as he bent over the bed to examine the indentation of the gardener's hobnailed boot. "It is quite simple. I did not realize that the foot would be inside the boot. You do not use your excellent mental capacities sufficiently. Well, what of the footmark?" I examined the bed carefully. "All the footmarks in the bed were made by the same boot," I said at length after a careful study. "You think so? Eh bien. I agree with you," said Poirot. He seemed quite uninterested, and as though he were thinking of something else. "At any rate," I remarked, "you will have one bee less in your bonnet now." "Mon Dieu! But what an idiom! What does it mean?" "What I meant was that now you will give up your interest in these footmarks." But to my surprise Poirot shook his head. "No, no, mon ami. At last I am on the right track. I am still in the dark, but, as I hinted just now to Monsieur Bex, these footmarks are the most important and interesting things in the case. That poor Giraud, I should not be surprised if he took no notice of them whatever." At that moment the front door opened, and M. Otet and the commissary came down the steps. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, we were coming to look for you," said the magistrate. "It is getting late, but I wish to pay a visit to Madame d'Aubroil. Without doubt she will be very much upset by Monsieur Renaud's death, and we may be fortunate enough to get a clue from her. The secret that he did not confide to his wife, it is possible that he may have told it to the woman whose love held him enslaved. We know where our Samsons are weak, don't we?" We said no more, but fell into line. Poirot walked with the examining magistrate, and the commissary and I followed a few paces behind. "There is no doubt that Francois's story is substantially correct," he remarked to me in a confidential tone. "I have been telephoning headquarters. It seems that 3 times in the last 6 weeks, that is to say since the arrival of Monsieur Renaud at Merlinville, Madame d'Aubroil has paid a large sum in notes into her banking account. Altogether the sum totals 200,000 francs. "Dear me," I said, considering, "that must be something like £4,000. "Precisely. Yes, there can be no doubt that he was absolutely infatuated. But it remains to be seen whether he confided his secret to her. The examining magistrate is hopeful, but I hardly share his views." During this conversation we were walking down the lane towards the fork in the road where our car had halted earlier in the afternoon, and in another moment I realized that the Villa Marguerite, the home of the mysterious Madame d'Aubroil, was the small house from which the beautiful girl had emerged. "She has lived here for many years," said the commissary, nodding his head towards the house. "Very quietly, very unobtrusively. She seems to have no friends or relations other than the acquaintances she has made in Merlinville. She never refers to the past, nor to her husband. One does not even know if he is alive or dead. There is a mystery about her, you comprehend." I nodded, my interest growing. "And the daughter?" I ventured. "A truly beautiful young girl, modest, devout, all that she should be. One pities her, for, though she may know nothing of the past, a man who wants to ask her hand in marriage must necessarily inform himself," and then the commissary shrugged his shoulders cynically. But it would not be her fault. I cried, with rising indignation. No. But what will you? A man is particular about his wife's antecedents. I was prevented from further argument by our arrival at the door. Motet rang the bell. A few minutes elapsed, and then we heard a footfall within, and the door was opened. On the threshold stood my young goddess of that afternoon. When she saw us, the colour left her cheeks, leaving her deathly white, and her eyes widened with apprehension. There was no doubt about it, she was afraid. Mademoiselle d'Orbroil, said Motet, sweeping off his hat, we regret infinitely to disturb you, but the exigencies of the law, you comprehend. My compliments to Madame your mother, and will she have the goodness to grant me a few moments' interview? For a moment the girl stood motionless. Her left hand was pressed to her side, as though to still the sudden unconquerable agitation of her heart. But she mastered herself, and said in a low voice, I will go and see. Please come inside. She entered a room on the left of the hall, and we heard the low murmur of her voice. And then another voice, much the same in timbre, but with a slightly harder inflection behind its mellow roundness, said, But certainly. Ask them to enter. In another minute we were face to face with the mysterious Madame d'Orbroil. She was not nearly so tall as her daughter, and the rounded curves of her figure had all the grace of full maturity. Her hair, again unlike her daughter's, was dark, and parted in the middle in the Madonna style. Her eyes, half hidden by the drooping lids, were blue. Though very well preserved, she was certainly no longer young, but her charm was of the quality which is independent of age. You wished to see me, monsieur? She asked. Yes, madame. Motet cleared his throat. I am investigating the death of Monsieur Renauld. You have heard of it, no doubt? She bowed her head without speaking. Her expression did not change. We came to ask you whether you can, throw any light upon the circumstances surrounding it. I? The surprise of her tone was excellent. Yes, madam. We have reason to believe that you were in the habit of visiting the dead man at his villa in the evenings. Is that so? The colour rose in the lady's pale cheeks, but she replied quietly. I deny your right to ask me such a question. Madam, we are investigating a murder. Well, what of it? I had nothing to do with the murder. Madam, we do not say that for a moment. But you knew the dead man well. Did he ever confide in you as to any danger that threatened him? Never. Did he ever mention his life in Santiago, and any enemies he may have made there? No. Then you can give us no help at all? I fear not. I really do not see why you should come to me. Cannot his wife tell you what you want to know? Her voice held a slender inflection of irony. Mrs. Renauld has told us all she can. Ah, said Madame d'Orbroil. I wonder. You wonder what, madam? Nothing. The examining magistrate looked at her. He was aware that he was fighting a duel, and that he had no mean antagonist. You persist in your statement that Monsieur Renauld confided nothing to you? Why should you think it likely that he should confide in me? Because, madam, said Motet, with calculated brutality, a man tells to his mistress what he does not always tell to his wife. Ah! She sprang forward. Her eyes flashed fire. Monsieur, you insult me. And before my daughter. I can tell you nothing. Have the goodness to leave my house. The honors undoubtedly rested with the lady. We left the Villa Marguerite like a shamefaced pack of schoolboys. The magistrate muttered angry ejaculations to himself. Poirot seemed lost in thought. Suddenly he came out of his reverie with a start, and inquired of Motet if there was a good hotel near at hand. There is a small place, the Hôtel des Bains, on this side of the town. A few hundred yards down the road. It will be handy for your investigations. We shall see you in the morning, then, I presume? Yes, I thank you, Monsieur Motet. With mutual civilities we parted company, Poirot and I going towards Merlinville, and the others returning to the Villa Geneviève. The French police system is very marvelous, said Poirot, looking after them. The information they possess about everyone's life, down to the most commonplace detail, is extraordinary. Though he has only been here a little over 6 weeks, they are perfectly well acquainted with Monsieur Renaud's tastes and pursuits, and at a moment's notice they can produce information as to Madame d'Aubroil's banking account, and the sums that have lately been paid in. Undoubtedly the dossier is a great institution. But what is that? He turned sharply. A figure was running hatless down the road after us. It was Marthe d'Aubroil. "I beg your pardon," she cried breathlessly, as she reached us. I should not do this, I know. You must not tell my mother. But is it true, what the people say, that Monsieur Renaud called in a detective before he died, and that you are he?" "Yes, mademoiselle," said Poirot gently. "It is quite true. But how did you learn it?" "François told our Amélie," explained Marthe with a blush. Poirot made a grimace. "The secrecy, it is impossible in an affair of this kind. Not that it matters. Well, mademoiselle, what is it you want to know?" The girl hesitated. She seemed longing, yet fearing, to speak. At last, almost in a whisper, she asked, "Is anyone suspected?" Poirot eyed her keenly. Then he replied evasively, "Suspicion is in the air at present, mademoiselle." "Yes, I know, but anyone in particular?" "Why do you want to know?" The girl seemed frightened by the question. All at once Poirot's words about her earlier in the day occurred to me. The girl with the anxious eyes. "Monsieur Renaud was always very kind to me," she replied at last. "It is natural that I should be interested." "I see," said Poirot. "Well, mademoiselle, suspicion at present is hovering round 2 persons. 2. I could have sworn there was a note of surprise and relief in her voice. "Their names are known, but they are presumed to be Chileans from Santiago. And now, mademoiselle, you see what comes of being young and beautiful. I have betrayed professional secrets for you." The girl laughed merrily, and then, rather shyly, she thanked him. "I must run back now. Maman will miss me." And she turned and ran back up the road, looking like a modern Atalanta. I stared after her. "Mon ami," said Poirot, in his gentle ironical voice, "is it that we are to remain planted here all night, just because you have seen a beautiful young woman, and your head is in a whirl?" I laughed and apologized. "But she is beautiful, Poirot. Anyone might be excused for being bowled over by her." But to my surprise Poirot shook his head very earnestly. "Ah, mon ami, do not set your heart on Marthe d'Aubroil. She is not for you, that one. Take it from Papa, Poirot." "Why," I cried, "the commissary assured me that she was as good as she is beautiful. A perfect angel." "Some of the greatest criminals I have known had the faces of angels," remarked Poirot cheerfully. "A malformation of the grey cells may coincide quite easily with the face of a Madonna." "Poirot," I cried, horrified, "you cannot mean that you suspect an innocent child like this." "Totata. Do not excite yourself. I have not said that I suspected her. But you must admit that her anxiety to know about the case is somewhat unusual." "For once I see farther than you do," I said. "Her anxiety is not for herself, but for her mother." "My friend," said Poirot, "as usual, you see nothing at all. Madame d'Aubroil is very well able to look after herself without her daughter worrying about her. I admit I was teasing you just now, but all the same I repeat what I said before. Do not set your heart on that girl. She is not for you. I, Hercule Poirot, know it. Sacré! If only I could remember where I had seen that face." "What face?" I asked, surprised. "The daughter's." "No. The mother's." Noting my surprise, he nodded emphatically. "But yes, it is as I tell you. It was a long time ago, when I was still with the police in Belgium. I have never actually seen the woman before, but I have seen her picture, and in connection with some case. I rather fancy." "Yes? I may be mistaken, but I rather fancy that it was a murder case." Chapter 8: An Unexpected Meeting. We were up at the villa betimes next morning. The man on guard at the gate did not bar our way this time. Instead, he respectfully saluted us, and we passed on to the house. The maid Léonie was just coming down the stairs, and seemed not averse to the prospect of a little conversation. Poirot inquired after the health of Mrs. Renauld. Léonie shook her head. She is terribly upset, the poor lady. She will eat nothing, but nothing. And she is as pale as a ghost. It is heartrending to see her. Ah, it is not I who would grieve like that for a man who had deceived me with another woman. Poirot nodded sympathetically. What you say is very just, but what will you? The heart of a woman who loves will forgive many blows. Still, undoubtedly there must have been many scenes of recrimination between them in the last few months. Again Léonie shook her head. Never, monsieur. Never have I heard Madame utter a word of protest, of reproach, even. She had the temper and disposition of an angel, quite different to monsieur. Monsieur Renauld had not the temper of an angel? Far from it. When he enraged himself, the whole house knew of it. The day that he quarrelled with Monsieur Jacques, ma foi. They might have been heard in the marketplace, they shouted so loud. Indeed, said Poirot. And when did this quarrel take place? Oh, it was just before Monsieur Jacques went to Paris. Almost he missed his train. He came out of the library, and caught up his bag which he had left in the hall. The automobile, it was being repaired, and he had to run for the station. I was dusting the salon, and I saw him pass, and his face was white with 2 burning spots of red. Ah, but he was angry. Léonie was enjoying her narrative thoroughly. And the dispute, what was it about? Ah, that I do not know, confessed Léonie. It is true that they shouted, but their voices were so loud and high, and they spoke so fast that only one well acquainted with English could have comprehended. But monsieur, he was like a thundercloud all day. Impossible to please him. The sound of a door shutting upstairs cut short Léonie's loquacity. And François who awaits me, she exclaimed, awakening to a tardy remembrance of her duties. That old one, she always scolds. One moment, mademoiselle. The examining magistrate, where is he? They have gone out to look at the automobile in the garage. Monsieur the commissary had some idea that it might have been used on the night of the murder. Quelle idée, murmured Poirot, as the girl disappeared. You will go out and join them? No, I shall await their return in the salon. It is cool there on this hot morning. This placid way of taking things did not quite commend itself to me. If you don't mind, I said, and hesitated. Not in the least. You wish to investigate on your own account, eh? Well, I'd rather like to have a look at Giraud, if he's anywhere about, and see what he's up to. The human foxhound, murmured Poirot, as he leaned back in a comfortable chair, and closed his eyes. By all means, my friend. Au revoir. I strolled out of the front door. It was certainly hot. I turned up the path we had taken the day before. I had a mind to study the scene of the crime myself. I did not go directly to the spot, however, but turned aside into the bushes, so as to come out on the link some 100 yards or so farther to the right. The shrubbery here was much denser, and I had quite a struggle to force my way through. When I emerged at last on the course, it was quite unexpectedly and with such vigor that I cannoned heavily into a young lady who had been standing with her back to the plantation. She not unnaturally gave a suppressed shriek, but I, too, uttered an exclamation of surprise, for it was my friend of the train, Cinderella. The surprise was mutual. You! We both exclaimed simultaneously. The young lady recovered herself first. My only aunt! She exclaimed. What are you doing here? For the matter of that, what are you? I retorted. When last I saw you, the day before yesterday, you were trotting home to England like a good little boy. When last I saw you, I said, you were trotting home with your sister, like a good little girl. By the way, how is your sister? A flash of white teeth rewarded me. How kind of you to ask. My sister is well, I thank you. She is here with you? She remained in town, said the minx with dignity. I don't believe you've got a sister, I laughed. If you have, her name is Harris. Do you remember mine? She asked with a smile. Cinderella. But you're going to tell me the real one now, aren't you? She shook her head with a wicked look. Not even why you're here? Oh, that. I suppose you've heard of members of my profession resting at expensive French watering places. Dirt cheap if you know where to go. I eyed her keenly. Still, you'd no intention of coming here when I met you 2 days ago? We all have our disappointments, said Miss Cinderella sententiously. There now, I've told you quite as much as is good for you. Little boys should not be inquisitive. You've not yet told me what you're doing here. You remember my telling you that my great friend was a detective? Yes? And perhaps you've heard about this crime at the Villa Geneviève? She stared at me. Her breast heaved, and her eyes grew wide and round. You don't mean that you're in on that? I nodded. There was no doubt that I had scored heavily. Her emotion, as she regarded me, was only too evident. For some few seconds she remained silent, staring at me. Then she nodded her head emphatically. Well, if that doesn't beat the band. Tote me round. I want to see all the horrors. What do you mean? What I say. Bless the boy, didn't I tell you I doted on crimes? I've been nosing round for hours. It's a real piece of luck happening on you this way. Come on, show me all the sights. But look here, wait a minute, I can't. Nobody's allowed in. They're awfully strict. Aren't you and your friends the big bugs? I was loath to relinquish my position of importance. Why are you so keen? I asked weakly. And what is it you want to see? Oh, everything. The place where it happened, and the weapon, and the body, and any fingerprints or interesting things like that. I've never had a chance before of being right in on a murder like this. It'll last me all my life. I turned away, sickened. What were women coming to nowadays? The girl's ghoulish excitement nauseated me. Come off your high horse, said the lady suddenly. And don't give yourself airs. When you got called to this job, did you put your nose in the air and say it was a nasty business, and you wouldn't be mixed up in it? No, but if you'd been here on a holiday, wouldn't you be nosing round just the same as I am? Of course you would. I'm a man. You're a woman. Your idea of a woman is someone who gets on a chair and shrieks if she sees a mouse. That's all prehistoric. But you will show me round, won't you? You see, it might make a big difference to me. In what way? They're keeping all the reporters out. I might make a big scoop with one of the papers. You don't know how much they pay for a bit of inside stuff. I hesitated. She slipped a small soft hand into mine. Please, there's a dear. I capitulated. Secretly, I knew that I should rather enjoy the part of showman. We repaired first to the spot where the body had been discovered. A man was on guard there, who saluted respectfully, knowing me by sight, and raised no questions as to my companion. Presumably he regarded her as vouched for by me. I explained to Cinderella just how the discovery had been made, and she listened attentively, sometimes putting an intelligent question. Then we turned our steps in the direction of the villa. I proceeded rather cautiously, for, truth to tell, I was not at all anxious to meet anyone. I took the girl through the shrubbery round to the back of the house where the small shed was. I recollected that yesterday evening, after relocking the door, M. Bex had left the key with the Sergeant de Ville, Marchord, in case Monsieur Giraud should require it while we are upstairs. I thought it quite likely that the Sûreté detective, after using it, had returned it to Marchord again. Leaving the girl out of sight in the shrubbery, I entered the house. Marchord was on duty outside the door of the salon. From within came the murmur of voices. Monsieur desires Monsieur Otet. He is within. He is again interrogating Francois. No, I said hastily, I don't want him. But I should very much like the key of the shed outside if it is not against regulations. But certainly, monsieur. He produced it. Here it is. Monsieur Otet gave orders that all facilities were to be placed at your disposal. You will return it to me when you have finished out there, that is all. Of course. I felt a thrill of satisfaction as I realized that in Marchord's eyes, at least, I ranked equally in importance with Poirot. The girl was waiting for me. She gave an exclamation of delight as she saw the key in my hand. You've got it then? Of course, I said coolly. All the same, you know, what I'm doing is highly irregular. You've been a perfect duck, and I shan't forget it. Come along. They can't see us from the house, can they? Wait a minute. I arrested her eager advance. I won't stop you if you really wish to go in. But do you? You've seen the grave and the grounds, and you've heard all the details of the affair. Isn't that enough for you? This is going to be gruesome, you know, and unpleasant. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I could not quite fathom. Then she laughed. Me for the horrors, she said. Come along. In silence we arrived at the door of the shed. I opened it and we passed in. I walked over to the body, and gently pulled down the sheet as Bex had done the preceding afternoon. A little gasping sound escaped from the girl's lips, and I turned and looked at her. There was horror on her face now, and those debonair high spirits of hers were quenched utterly. She had not chosen to listen to my advice, and she was punished now for her disregard of it. I felt singularly merciless towards her. She should go through with it now. I turned the corpse over gently. You see, I said. He was stabbed in the back. Her voice was almost soundless. With what? I nodded towards the glass jar. That dagger. Suddenly the girl reeled, and then sank down in a heap. I sprang to her assistance. You are faint. Come out of here. It has been too much for you. Water, she murmured. Quick. Water. I left her, and rushed into the house. Fortunately none of the servants were about, and I was able to secure a glass of water unobserved and add a few drops of brandy from a pocket flask. In a few minutes I was back again. The girl was lying as I had left her, but a few sips of the brandy and water revived her in a marvelous manner. Take me out of here, oh, quickly, quickly, she cried, shuddering. Supporting her with my arm, I led her out into the air, and she pulled the door to behind her. Then she drew a deep breath. That's better. Oh, it was horrible. Why did you ever let me go in? I felt this to be so feminine that I could not forbear a smile. Secretly, I was not dissatisfied with her collapse. It proved that she was not quite so callous as I had thought her. After all, she was little more than a child, and her curiosity had probably been of the unthinking order. I did my best to stop you, you know, I said gently. I suppose you did. Well, goodbye. Look here, you can't start off like that, all alone. You're not fit for it. I insist on accompanying you back to Merlinville. Nonsense. I'm quite all right now. Supposing you felt faint again? No, I shall come with you. But this she combated with a good deal of energy. In the end, however, I prevailed so far as to be allowed to accompany her to the outskirts of the town. We retraced our steps over our former route, passing the grave again, and making a detour onto the road. Where the first straggling line of shops began, she stopped and held out her hand. Goodbye, and thank you ever so much for coming with me. Are you sure you're all right now? Quite, thanks. I hope you don't get into any trouble over showing me things. I disclaimed the idea lightly. Well, goodbye. Au revoir, I corrected. If you're staying here, we shall meet again. She flashed a smile at me. That's so. Au revoir, then. Wait a second, you haven't told me your address. Oh, I'm staying at the Hôtel du Fer. It's a little place, but quite good. Come and look me up tomorrow. I will, I said, with perhaps rather unnecessary empressement. I watched her out of sight, then turned and retraced my steps to the villa. I remembered that I had not relocked the door of the shed. Fortunately, no one had noticed the oversight, and turning the key I removed it and returned it to the Sergeant de Ville. And, as I did so, it came upon me suddenly that though Cinderella had given me her address, I still did not know her name. Chapter 9. Giraud finds some clues. In the salon I found the examining magistrate busily interrogating the old gardener, Auguste. Poirot and the commissary, who were both present, greeted me respectively with a smile and a polite bow. I slipped quietly into a seat. Tête was painstaking and meticulous in the extreme, but did not succeed in eliciting anything of importance. The gardening gloves Auguste admitted to be his. He wore them when handling a certain species of primula plant which was poisonous to some people. He could not say when he had worn them last. Certainly he had not missed them. Where were they kept? Sometimes in one place, sometimes in another. The spade was usually to be found in the small tool shed. Was it locked? Of course it was locked. Where was the key kept? Parbleu, it was in the door, of course. There was nothing of value to steal. Who would have expected a party of bandits, or assassins? Such things did not happen in Madame la Vicomtesse's time. Tête signifying that he had finished with him, the old man withdrew, grumbling to the last. Remembering Poirot's unaccountable insistence on the footprints in the flower-beds, I scrutinized him narrowly as he gave his evidence. Either he had nothing to do with the crime or he was a consummate actor. Suddenly, just as he was going out of the door, an idea struck me. "Pardon, Monsieur Tête," I cried, "but will you permit me to ask him one question?" "But certainly, monsieur." Thus encouraged, I turned to Auguste. "Where do you keep your boots?" "On my feet," growled the old man. "Where else?" "But when you go to bed at night?" "Under my bed." "But who cleans them?" "Nobody." "Why should they be cleaned? Is it that I promenade myself on the front like a young man? On Sunday I wear the Sunday boots, but otherwise," he shrugged his shoulders. I shook my head, discouraged. Well, said the magistrate, "we do not advance very much. Undoubtedly we are held up until we get the return cable from Santiago. Has anyone seen Giraud? In verity that one lacks politeness. I have a very good mind to send for him and—" "You will not have to send far." The quiet voice startled us. Giraud was standing outside looking in through the open window. He leapt lightly into the room and advanced to the table. "Here I am, at your service. Accept my excuses for not presenting myself sooner." Not at all," said the magistrate, rather confused. "Of course I am only a detective," continued the other. "I know nothing of interrogatories. Were I conducting one, I should be inclined to do so without an open window. Anyone standing outside can so easily hear all that passes. But no matter." Tête flushed angrily. There was evidently going to be no love lost between the examining magistrate and the detective in charge of the case. They had fallen foul of each other at the start. Perhaps in any event it would have been much the same. To Giraud, all examining magistrates were fools, and to Tête, who took himself seriously, the casual manner of the Paris detective could not fail to give offense. "Eh bien, Monsieur Giraud," said the magistrate rather sharply. "Without doubt you have been employing your time to a marvel. You have the names of the assassins for us, have you not? And also the precise spot where they find themselves now?" Unmoved by this irony, Giraud replied, "I know at least where they have come from." Giraud took two small objects from his pocket and laid them down on the table. We crowded round. The objects were very simple ones, the stub of a cigarette and an unlighted match. The detective wheeled round on Poirot. "What do you see there?" he asked. There was something almost brutal in his tone. It made my cheeks flush. But Poirot remained unmoved. He shrugged his shoulders. "A cigarette end and a match. And what does that tell you?" Poirot spread out his hands. "It tells me nothing." "Ah," said Giraud, in a satisfied voice, You haven't made a study of these things. That's not an ordinary match, not in this country at least. It's common enough in South America. Luckily it's unlighted. I mightn't have recognized it otherwise. Evidently one of the men threw away his cigarette and lit another, spilling one match out of the box as he did so. And the other match? Asked Poirot. Which match? The one he did light his cigarette with. You have found that also? No. Perhaps you didn't search very thoroughly. Not search thoroughly. For a moment it seemed as though the detective was going to break out angrily, but with an effort he controlled himself. I see you love a joke, Monsieur Poirot. But in any case, match or no match, the cigarette end would be sufficient. It is a South American cigarette with licorice pectoral paper. Poirot bowed. The commissary spoke. The cigarette end and match might have belonged to Monsieur Renauld. Remember, it is only 2 years since he returned from South America. No, replied the other confidently. I have already searched among the effects of Monsieur Renauld. The cigarettes he smoked and the matches he used are quite different. You do not think it odd, asked Poirot, that these strangers should come unprovided with a weapon, with gloves, with a spade, and that they should so conveniently find all these things? Giraud smiled in a rather superior manner. Undoubtedly it is strange. Indeed, without the theory that I hold, it would be inexplicable. Aha! Said M. Otet. An accomplice within the house. Or outside it, said Giraud, with a peculiar smile. But someone must have admitted them. We cannot allow that, by an unparalleled piece of good fortune, they found the door ajar for them to walk in. The door was opened for them, but it could just as easily be opened from outside, by someone who possessed a key. But who did possess a key? Giraud shrugged his shoulders. As for that, no one who possesses one is going to admit the fact if he can help it. But several people might have had one. Monsieur Jacques Renauld, the son, for instance. It is true that he is on his way to South America, but he might have lost the key or had it stolen from him. Then there is the gardener, he has been here many years. One of the younger servants may have a lover. It is easy to take an impression of a key and have one cut. There are many possibilities. Then there is another person who, I should judge, is exceedingly likely to have such a thing. Who is that? Madame d'Aubroil, said the detective. Said the magistrate. So you have heard about that, have you? I hear everything, said Giraud imperturbably. There is one thing I could swear you have not heard, said M. Otet, delighted to be able to show superior knowledge, and without more ado he retailed the story of the mysterious visitor the night before. He also touched on the check made out to Devine, and finally handed Giraud the letter signed Bella. All very interesting. But my theory remains unaffected. And your theory is? For the moment I prefer not to say. Remember, I am only just beginning my investigations. Tell me one thing, Monsieur Giraud, said Poirot suddenly. Your theory allows for the door being opened. It does not explain why it was left open. When they departed, would it not have been natural for them to close it behind them? If a Sergeant de Ville had chanced to come up to the house, as is sometimes done to see that all is well, they might have been discovered and overtaken almost at once. Bah! They forgot it. A mistake, I grant you. Then, to my surprise, Poirot uttered almost the same words as he had uttered to Bex the previous evening. I do not agree with you. The door being left open was the result of either design or necessity, and any theory that does not admit that fact is bound to prove vain. We all regarded the little man with a good deal of astonishment. The confession of ignorance drawn from him over the match end had, I thought, been bound to humiliate him, but here he was self-satisfied as ever, laying down the law to Giraud without a tremor. The detective twisted his moustache, eyeing my friend in a somewhat bantering fashion. You don't agree with me, eh? Well, what strikes you particularly about the case? Let's hear your views. One thing presents itself to me as being significant. Tell me, Monsieur Giraud, does nothing strike you as familiar about this case? Is there nothing it reminds you of? Familiar? Reminds me of? I can't say offhand. I don't think so, though. You are wrong, said Poirot quietly. A crime almost precisely similar has been committed before. When? And where? Ah, that, unfortunately, I cannot for the moment remember, but I shall do so. I had hoped you might be able to assist me. Giraud snorted incredulously. There have been many affairs of masked men. I cannot remember the details of them all. The crimes all resemble each other more or less. There is such a thing as the individual touch. Poirot suddenly assumed his lecturing manner, and addressed us collectively. I am speaking to you now of the psychology of crime. Monsieur Giraud knows quite well that each criminal has his particular method, and that the police, when called in to investigate, say, a case of burglary, can often make a shrewd guess at the offender, simply by the peculiar methods he has employed. Japp would tell you the same. Hastings, man is an unoriginal animal. Unoriginal within the law in his daily respectable life, equally unoriginal outside the law. If a man commits a crime, any other crime he commits will resemble it closely. The English murderer who disposed of his wives in succession by drowning them in their baths was a case in point. Had he varied his methods, he might have escaped detection to this day. But he obeyed the common dictates of human nature, arguing that what had once succeeded would succeed again, and he paid the penalty of his lack of originality. And the point of all this? Sneered Giraud. That, when you have two crimes precisely similar in design and execution, you find the same brain behind them both. I am looking for that brain, Monsieur Giraud, and I shall find it. Here we have a true clue, a psychological clue. You may know all about cigarettes and match ends, Monsieur Giraud, but I, Hercule Poirot, know the mind of man. Giraud remained singularly unimpressed. For your guidance, continued Poirot, I will also advise you of one fact which might fail to be brought to your notice. The wristwatch of Madame Renaud, on the day following the tragedy, had gained 2 hours. Giraud stared. Perhaps it was in the habit of gaining? As a matter of fact, I am told it did. Very well, then. All the same, 2 hours is a good deal, said Poirot softly. Then there is the matter of the footprints in the flower bed. He nodded his head towards the open window. Giraud took 2 eager strides and looked out. But I see no footprints. No, said Poirot, straightening a little pile of books on a table. There are none. For a moment an almost murderous rage obscured Giraud's face. He took 2 strides towards his tormentor, but at that moment the salon door was opened, and Marchord announced. Monsieur Stoner, the secretary, has just arrived from England. May he enter? Chapter 10. Gabriel Stoner. The man who now entered the room was a striking figure. Very tall, with a well-knit, athletic frame, and a deeply bronzed face and neck, he dominated the assembly. Even Giraud seemed anemic beside him. When I knew him better I realized that Gabriel Stoner was quite an unusual personality. English by birth, he had knocked about all over the world. He had shot big game in Africa, traveled in Korea, ranched in California, and traded in the South Sea Islands. His unerring eye picked out M. Otet. The examining magistrate in charge of the case? Pleased to meet you, sir. This is a terrible business. How's Mrs. Renaud? Is she bearing up fairly well? It must have been an awful shock to her. Terrible, terrible, said M. Otet. Permit me to introduce Monsieur Bex, our commissary of police, Monsieur Giraud of the Sûreté. This gentleman is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Mr. Renaud sent for him, but he arrived too late to do anything to avert the tragedy. A friend of Monsieur Poirot's, Captain Hastings. Stoner looked at Poirot with some interest. Sent for you, did he? You did not know, then, that Monsieur Renaud contemplated calling a detective? Interposed M. Bex. No, I didn't. But it doesn't surprise me a bit. Why? Because the old man was rattled. I don't know what it was all about. He didn't confide in me. We weren't on those terms. But rattled he was, and badly. Said M. Otet. But you have no notion of the cause. That's what I said, sir. You will pardon me, Monsieur Stoner, but we must begin with a few formalities. Your name? Gabriel Stoner. How long ago was it that you became secretary to Monsieur Renauld? About 2 years ago, when he first arrived from South America. I met him through a mutual friend, and he offered me the post. A thundering good boss he was too. Did he talk to you much about his life in South America? Yes, a good bit. Do you know if he was ever in Santiago? Several times, I believe. He never mentioned any special incident that occurred there, anything that might have provoked some vendetta against him. Never. Did he speak of any secret that he had acquired while sojourning there? Not that I can remember. But, for all that, there was a mystery about him. I've never heard him speak of his boyhood, for instance, or of any incident prior to his arrival in South America. He was a French-Canadian by birth, I believe, but I've never heard him speak of his life in Canada. He could shut up like a clam if he liked. So, as far as you know, he had no enemies, and you can give us no clue as to any secret to obtain possession of which he might have been murdered? That's so, Monsieur Stoner. Have you ever heard the name of Devine in connection with Monsieur Renauld? Devine. He tried the name over thoughtfully. I don't think I have. And yet it seems familiar. Do you know a lady, a friend of Monsieur Renaud's, whose Christian name is Bella? Again Mr. Stoner shook his head. Bella Devine? Is that the full name? It's curious. I'm sure I know it. But for the moment I can't remember in what connection. The magistrate coughed. You understand, Monsieur Stoner, the case is like this. There must be no reservations. You might, perhaps, through a feeling of consideration for Madame Renauld, for whom, I gather, you have a great esteem and affection, you might, in fact, said M. Otet, getting rather tied up in his sentence, there must absolutely be no reservations. Stoner stared at him, a dawning light of comprehension in his eyes. I don't quite get you, he said gently. Where does Mrs. Renauld come in? I've an immense respect and affection for that lady, she's a very wonderful and unusual type, but I don't quite see how my reservations, or otherwise, could affect her. Not if this Bella Devine should prove to have been something more than a friend to her husband? Ah, said Stoner. I get you now. But I'll bet my bottom dollar that you're wrong. The old man never so much as looked at a petticoat. He just adored his own wife. They were the most devoted couple I know. M. Otet shook his head gently. Monsieur Stoner, we hold absolute proof, a love letter written by this Bella to Monsieur Renauld, accusing him of having tired of her. Moreover, we have further proof that, at the time of his death, he was carrying on an intrigue with a Frenchwoman, a Madame d'Aubroil, who rents the adjoining villa. The secretary's eyes narrowed. Hold on, sir. You're barking up the wrong tree. I knew Paul Renauld. What you've just been saying is plumb impossible. There's some other explanation. The magistrate shrugged his shoulders. What other explanation could there be? What leads you to think it was a love affair? Madame d'Aubroil was in the habit of visiting him here in the evenings. Also, since Monsieur Renauld came to the Villa Geneviève, Madame d'Aubroil has paid large sums of money into the bank in notes. In all, the amount totals £4,000 of your English money. I guess that's right, said Stoner quietly. I transmitted him those sums in notes at his request. But it wasn't an intrigue. What else could it be? Blackmail, said Stoner sharply, bringing down his hand with a slam on the table. That's what it was. Ah, cried the magistrate, shaken in spite of himself. Blackmail, repeated Stoner. The old man was being bled, and at a good rate too. 4,000 in a couple of months. Phew. I told you just now there was a mystery about Renauld. Evidently this Madame d'Aubroil knew enough of it to put the screw on. It is possible, the commissary cried excitedly. Decidedly, it is possible. Possible? Roared Stoner. It's certain. Tell me, have you asked Mrs. Renaud about this love affair stunt of yours? No, monsieur. We did not wish to occasion her any distress if it could reasonably be avoided. Distress? Why, she'd laugh in your face. I tell you, she and Renaud were a couple in 100. Ah, that reminds me of another point, said M. Otet. Did Monsieur Renaud take you into his confidence at all as to the dispositions of his will? I know all about it, took it to the lawyers for him after he'd drawn it out. I can give you the name of his solicitors if you want to see it. They've got it there. Quite simple. Half in trust to his wife for her lifetime, the other half to his son. A few legacies. I rather think he left me 1,000. When was this will drawn up? Oh, about 1.5 years ago. Would it surprise you very much, Monsieur Stoner, to hear that Monsieur Renaud had made another will, less than a fortnight ago? Stoner was obviously very much surprised. I'd no idea of it. What's it like? The whole of his vast fortune is left unreservedly to his wife. There is no mention of his son. Mr. Stoner gave vent to a prolonged whistle. I call that rather rough on the lad. His mother adores him of course, but to the world at large it looks rather like a want of confidence on his father's part. It will be rather galling to his pride. Still, it all goes to prove what I told you, that Renaud and his wife were on first-rate terms. Quite so, said M. Otet. It is possible we shall have to revise our ideas on several points. We have, of course, cabled to Santiago, and are expecting a reply from there any minute. In all probability, everything will then be perfectly clear and straightforward. On the other hand, if your suggestion of blackmail is true, Madame d'Aubroil ought to be able to give us valuable information. Poirot interjected a remark. Monsieur Stoner, the English chauffeur, Masters, had he been long with Monsieur Renaud? Over 1 year. Have you any idea whether he has ever been in South America? I'm quite sure he hasn't. Before coming to M. Renaud he had been for many years with some people in Gloucestershire whom I know well. In fact, you can answer for him as being above suspicion? Absolutely. Poirot seemed somewhat crestfallen. Meanwhile the magistrate had summoned Marchand. My compliments to Madame Renaud, and I should be glad to speak to her for a few minutes. Beg her not to disturb herself. I will wait upon her upstairs. Marchand saluted and disappeared. We waited some minutes, and then, to our surprise, the door opened, and Mrs. Renaud, deathly pale in her heavy mourning, entered the room. M. Otet brought forward a chair, uttering vigorous protestations, and she thanked him with a smile. Stoner was holding one hand of hers in his with an eloquent sympathy. Words evidently failed him. Mrs. Renaud turned to M. Otet. You wish to ask me something? With your permission, madam. I understand your husband was a French-Canadian by birth. Can you tell me anything of his youth or upbringing? She shook her head. My husband was always very reticent about himself, monsieur. He came from the northwest, I know, but I fancy that he had an unhappy childhood, for he never cared to speak of that time. Our life was lived entirely in the present and the future. Was there any mystery in his past life? Mrs. Renaud smiled a little and shook her head. Nothing so romantic, I am sure, monsieur. M. Otet also smiled. True, we must not permit ourselves to get melodramatic. There is one thing more, he hesitated. Stoner broke in impetuously. They've got an extraordinary idea into their heads, Mrs. Renaud. They actually fancy that Mr. Renaud was carrying on an intrigue with a Madame d'Aubroil who, it seems, lives next door. The scarlet colour flamed into Mrs. Renaud's cheeks. She flung her head up, then bit her lip, her face quivering. Stoner stood looking at her in astonishment, but M. Bex leaned forward and said gently, We regret to cause you pain, madam, but have you any reason to believe that Madame d'Aubroil was your husband's mistress? With a sob of anguish, Mrs. Renaud buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved convulsively. At last she lifted her head and said brokenly, "She may have been. Never, in all my life, have I seen anything to equal the blank amazement on Stoner's face. He was thoroughly taken aback." Chapter 11. Jack Renauld. What the next development of the conversation would have been I cannot say, for at that moment the door was thrown open violently and a tall young man strode into the room. Just for a moment I had the uncanny sensation that the dead man had come to life again. Then I realized that this dark head was untouched with grey, and that, in point of fact, it was a mere boy who now burst in among us with so little ceremony. He went straight to Mrs. Renauld with an impetuosity that took no heed of the presence of others. "Mother! Jack!" With a cry she folded him in her arms. "My dearest? But what brings you here? You were to sail on the Ansera from Cherbourg 2 days ago?" Then, suddenly recalling to herself the presence of others, she turned with a certain dignity, "My son, messieurs." "Aha!" said Otet, acknowledging the young man's bow. "So you did not sail on the Ansera?" "No, monsieur. As I was about to explain, the Ansera was detained 24 hours through engine trouble. I should have sailed last night instead of the night before, but, happening to buy an evening paper, I saw in it an account of the awful tragedy that had befallen us." His voice broke and the tears came into his eyes. "My poor father, my poor father." Staring at him like one in a dream, Mrs. Renauld repeated, "So you did not sail?" And then, with a gesture of infinite weariness, she murmured as though to herself, "After all, it does not matter, now." "Sit down, Monsieur Renauld, I beg of you," said Otet, indicating a chair. "My sympathy for you is profound. It must have been a terrible shock to you to learn the news as you did. However, it is most fortunate that you were prevented from sailing. I am in hopes that you may be able to give us just the information we need to clear up this mystery. I am at your disposal, monsieur. Ask me any questions you please. To begin with, I understand that this journey was being undertaken at your father's request." "Quite so, monsieur. I received a telegram bidding me to proceed without delay to Buenos Aires, and from thence via the Andes to Valparaiso, and on to Santiago." "Ah. And the object of this journey?" "I have no idea." "What?" "No. See, here in the telegram." The magistrate took it and read it aloud. "Proceed immediately Cherbourg, embark Ansera sailing tonight Buenos Aires. Ultimate destination Santiago. Further instructions will await you Buenos Aires. Do not fail. Matter is of utmost importance. Renauld." And there had been no previous correspondence on the matter. Jack Renauld shook his head. "That is the only intimation of any kind. I knew, of course, that my father, having lived so long out there, had necessarily many interests in South America. But he had never mooted any suggestion of sending me out." "You have, of course, been a good deal in South America, Renauld?" "I was there as a child. But I was educated in England, and spent most of my holidays in that country, so I really know far less of South America than might be supposed. You see, the war broke out when I was 17. You served in the English Flying Corps, did you not?" "Yes, monsieur." Otet nodded his head and proceeded with his inquiries along the, by now, well-known lines. In response, Jack Renauld declared definitely that he knew nothing of any enmity his father might have incurred in the city of Santiago or elsewhere in the South American continent, that he had noticed no change in his father's manner of late, and that he had never heard him refer to a secret. He had regarded the mission to South America as connected with business interests. As Otet paused for a minute, the quiet voice of Giraud broke in. "I should like to put a few questions of my own, Monsieur le Juge." "By all means, Monsieur Giraud, if you wish," said the magistrate coldly. Giraud edged his chair a little nearer to the table. "Were you on good terms with your father, Monsieur Renauld?" "Certainly I was," returned the lad haughtily. "You assert that positively?" "Yes." "No little disputes, Eh? Jack shrugged his shoulders. Everyone may have a difference of opinion now and then. Quite so, quite so. But, if anyone were to assert that you had a violent quarrel with your father on the eve of your departure for Paris, that person, without doubt, would be lying. I could not but admire the ingenuity of Giraud. His boast, "I know everything," had been no idle one. Jack Renaud was clearly disconcerted by the question. We did have an argument," he admitted. "Ah, an argument. In the course of that argument, did you use this phrase, 'When you are dead I can do as I please'?" "I may have done," muttered the other. "I don't know." "In response to that, did your father say, 'But I am not dead yet'?" To which you responded, "I wish you were." The boy made no answer. His hands fiddled nervously with the things on the table in front of him. "I must request an answer, please, Monsieur Renaud," said Giraud sharply. With an angry exclamation, the boy swept a heavy paper knife to the floor. "What does it matter? You might as well know. Yes, I did quarrel with my father. I dare say I said all those things. I was so angry I cannot even remember what I said. I was furious. I could almost have killed him at that moment. There, make the most of that." He leant back in his chair, flushed and defiant. Giraud smiled, then, moving his chair back a little, said, "That is all. You would, without doubt, prefer to continue the interrogatory, Monsieur Autet." "Ah, yes, exactly," said M. Autet. "And what was the subject of your quarrel?" "That I decline to state." M. Autet sat up in his chair. "Monsieur Renaud, it is not permitted to trifle with the law," he thundered. "What was the subject of the quarrel?" Young Renaud remained silent, his boyish face sullen and overcast. But another voice spoke, imperturbable and calm, the voice of Hercule Poirot. "I will inform you, if you like, monsieur." "You know?" "Certainly I know. The subject of the quarrel was Mademoiselle Marthe d'Aubroil." Renaud sprang round, startled. The magistrate leaned forward. "Is that so, monsieur?" Jack Renaud bowed his head. "Yes," he admitted. "I love Mademoiselle d'Aubroil, and I wish to marry her." When I informed my father of the fact, he flew at once into a violent rage. Naturally, I could not stand hearing the girl I loved insulted, and I, too, lost my temper. M. Autet looked across at Mrs. Renaud. "You were aware of this attachment, madam?" "I feared it," she replied simply. "Mother," cried the boy. "You too. Marthe is as good as she is beautiful. What can you have against her?" "I have nothing against Mademoiselle d'Aubroil in any way. But I should prefer you to marry an Englishwoman, or if a Frenchwoman, not one who has a mother of doubtful antecedents." Her rancor against the older woman showed plainly in her voice, and I could well understand that it must have been a bitter blow to her when her only son showed signs of falling in love with the daughter of her rival. Mrs. Renaud continued, addressing the magistrate. "I ought, perhaps, to have spoken to my husband on the subject, but I hoped that it was only a boy and girl flirtation which would blow over all the quicker if no notice was taken of it. I blame myself now for my silence, but my husband, as I told you, had seemed so anxious and careworn, different altogether from his normal self, that I was chiefly concerned not to give him any additional worry." M. Autet nodded. "When you informed your father of your intentions towards Mademoiselle d'Aubroil," he resumed, "he was surprised?" "He seemed completely taken aback. Then he ordered me peremptorily to dismiss any such idea from my mind. He would never give his consent to such a marriage. Nettled, I demanded what he had against Mademoiselle d'Aubroil. To that he could give no satisfactory reply, but spoke in slighting terms of the mystery surrounding the lives of the mother and daughter. I answered that I was marrying Marthe and not her antecedents, but he shouted me down with a peremptory refusal to discuss the matter in any way. The whole thing must be given up. The injustice and high-handedness of it all maddened me, especially since he himself always seemed to go out of his way to be attentive to the d'Aubroils and was always suggesting that they should be asked to the house. I lost my head, and we quarreled in earnest, My father reminded me that I was entirely dependent on him, and it must have been in answer to that I made the remark about doing as I pleased after his death. Poirot interrupted with a quick question. You were aware, then, of the terms of your father's will? I knew that he had left half his fortune to me, the other half in trust for my mother, to come to me at her death, replied the lad. Proceed with your story, said the magistrate. After that we shouted at each other in sheer rage, until I suddenly realized that I was in danger of missing my train to Paris. I had to run for the station, still in a white heat of fury. However, once well away, I calmed down. I wrote to Marthe, telling her what had happened, and her reply soothed me still further. She pointed out to me that we had only to be steadfast, and any opposition was bound to give way at last. Our affection for each other must be tried and proved, and when my parents realized that it was no light infatuation on my part, they would doubtless relent towards us. Of course, to her, I had not dwelt on my father's principal objection to the match. I soon saw that I should do my cause no good by violence. To pass to another matter, are you acquainted with the name of Devine, Monsieur Renauld? Devine? Said Jack. Devine? He leant forward and slowly picked up the paper knife he had swept from the table. As he lifted his head, his eyes met the watching ones of Giraud. Devine? No, I can't say I do. Will you read this letter, Monsieur Renauld? And tell me if you have any idea as to who the person was who addressed it to your father. Jack Renaud took the letter and read it through, the color mounting in his face as he did so. Addressed to my father? The emotion and indignation in his tones were evident. Yes. We found it in the pocket of his coat. He hesitated, throwing the merest fraction of a glance towards his mother. The magistrate understood. As yet, no. Can you give us any clue as to the writer? I have no idea whatsoever. Otet sighed. A most mysterious case. Well, I suppose we can now rule out the letter altogether. Let me see, where were we? Oh, the weapon. I fear this may give you pain, Monsieur Renaud. I understand it was a present from you to your mother. Very sad, very distressing. Jack Renaud leaned forward. His face, which had flushed during the perusal of the letter, was now deadly white. Do you mean that it was with an aeroplane wire paper cutter that my father was killed? But it's impossible. A little thing like that. Alas, Monsieur Renaud, it is only too true. An ideal little tool, I fear. Sharp and easy to handle. Where is it? Can I see it? Is it still in the body? Oh no, it has been removed. You would like to see it? To make sure? It would be as well, perhaps, though Madame has already identified it. Still, Monsieur Bex, might I trouble you? Certainly. I will fetch it immediately. Would it not be better to take Monsieur Renaud to the shed? Suggested Giraud smoothly. Without doubt he would wish to see his father's body. The boy made a shivering gesture of negation, and the magistrate, always disposed to cross Giraud whenever possible, replied. But no, not at present. Monsieur Bex will be so kind as to bring it to us here. The commissary left the room. Stoner crossed to Jack and wrung him by the hand. Poirot had risen, and was adjusting a pair of candlesticks that struck his trained eye as being a shade askew. The magistrate was reading the mysterious love letter through a last time, clinging desperately to his first theory of jealousy and a stab in the back. Suddenly the door burst open and the commissary rushed in. Monsieur le juge. Monsieur le juge. But yes. What is it? The dagger. It is gone. What, gone? Vanished. Disappeared. The glass jar that contained it is empty. What? I cried. Impossible. Why, only this morning I saw, the words died on my tongue. But the attention of the entire room was diverted to me. What is that you say? Cried the commissary. This morning? I saw it there this morning, I said slowly. About an hour and a half ago, to be accurate. You went to the shed, then? How did you get the key? I asked the Sergeant de Ville for it. And you went there? Why? I hesitated, but in the end I decided that the only thing to do was to make a clean breast of it. Monsieur Otet, I said, I have committed a grave fault, for which I must crave your indulgence. Proceed, monsieur. The fact of the matter is, I said, wishing myself anywhere else but where I was, that I met a young lady, an acquaintance of mine. She displayed a great desire to see everything that was to be seen, and well, in short, I took the key to show her the body. Ah! cried the magistrate indignantly. But it is a grave fault you have committed there, Captain Hastings. It is altogether most irregular. You should not have permitted yourself this folly. I know, I said meekly. Nothing that you can say could be too severe, monsieur. You did not invite this lady to come here? Certainly not. I met her quite by accident. She is an English lady who happens to be staying in Merlinville, though I was not aware of that until my unexpected meeting with her. Well, said the magistrate, softening. It was most irregular, but the lady is without doubt young and beautiful. What it is to be young! And he sighed sentimentally. But the commissary, less romantic and more practical, took up the tale. But did you not reclose and lock the door when you departed? That's just it, I said slowly. That's what I blame myself for so terribly. My friend was upset at the sight. She nearly fainted. I got her some brandy and water, and afterwards insisted on accompanying her back to the town. In the excitement I forgot to relock the door. I only did so when I got back to the villa. Then for 20 minutes at least, said the commissary slowly. He stopped. Exactly, I said. 20 minutes, mused the commissary. It is deplorable, said M. Otet, his sternness of manner returning. Without precedent. Suddenly another voice spoke. You find it deplorable? Asked Giraud. Certainly I do. I find it admirable, said the other imperturbably. This unexpected ally quite bewildered me. Admirable, Monsieur Giraud? Asked the magistrate, studying him cautiously out of the corner of his eye. Precisely. And why? Because we know now that the assassin, or an accomplice of the assassin, has been near the villa only an hour ago. It will be strange if, with that knowledge, we do not shortly lay hands upon him. There was a note of menace in his voice. He continued, he risked a good deal to gain possession of that dagger. Perhaps he feared that fingerprints might be discovered on it. Poirot turned to Bex. You said there were none? Giraud shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps he could not be sure. Poirot looked at him. You are wrong, Monsieur Giraud. The assassin wore gloves. So he must have been sure. I do not say it was the assassin himself. It may have been an accomplice who was not aware of that fact. The magistrate's clerk was gathering up the papers on the table. M. Otet addressed us. Our work here is finished. Perhaps, Monsieur Renauld, you will listen while your evidence is read over to you. I have purposely kept all the proceedings as informal as possible. I have been called original in my methods, but I maintain that there is much to be said for originality. The case is now in the clever hands of the renowned Monsieur Giraud. He will without doubt distinguish himself. Indeed, I wonder that he has not already laid his hands upon the murderers. Madam, again let me assure you of my heartfelt sympathy. Messieurs, I wish you all good day. And, accompanied by his clerk and the commissary, he took his departure. Poirot tugged out that large turnip of a watch of his and observed the time. Let us return to the hotel for lunch, my friend, he said. And you shall recount to me in full the indiscretions of this morning. No one is observing us. We need make no adieu. We went quietly out of the room. The examining magistrate had just driven off in his car. I was going down the steps when Poirot's voice arrested me. One little moment, my friend. Dexterously he whipped out his yard measure and proceeded, quite solemnly, to measure an overcoat hanging in the hall, from the collar to the hem. I had not seen it hanging there before, and guessed that it belonged to either Mr. Stoner or Jack Renaud. Then, with a little satisfied grunt, Poirot returned the measure to his pocket and followed me out into the open air. Chapter 12. Poirot elucidates certain points. "Why did you measure that overcoat?" I asked, with some curiosity, as we walked down the hot white road at a leisurely pace. "Parbleu! To see how long it was," replied my friend imperturbably. I was vexed. Poirot's incurable habit of making a mystery out of nothing never failed to irritate me. I relapsed into silence, and followed a train of thought of my own. Although I had not noticed them specially at the time, certain words Mrs. Renaud had addressed to her son now recurred to me, fraught with a new significance. "So you did not sail?" she had said, and then had added, "After all, it does not matter, now." What has she meant by that? The words were enigmatical, significant. Was it possible that she knew more than we supposed? She had denied all knowledge of the mysterious mission with which her husband was to have entrusted his son. But was she really less ignorant than she pretended? Could she enlighten us if she chose, and was her silence part of a carefully thought-out and preconceived plan? The more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that I was right. Mrs. Renaud knew more than she chose to tell. In her surprise at seeing her son, she had momentarily betrayed herself. I felt convinced that she knew, if not the assassins, at least the motive for the assassination. But some very powerful considerations must keep her silent. "You think profoundly, my friend," remarked Poirot, breaking in upon my reflections. "What is it that intrigues you so?" I told him, sure of my ground, though feeling expectant that he would ridicule my suspicions. But to my surprise he nodded thoughtfully. "You are quite right, Hastings. From the beginning I have been sure that she was keeping something back. At first I suspected her, if not of inspiring, at least of conniving at the crime." "You suspected her?" I cried. "But certainly. She benefits enormously, in fact, by this new will. She is the only person to benefit. So, from the start, she was singled out for attention. You may have noticed that I took an early opportunity of examining her wrists. I wished to see whether there was any possibility that she had gagged and bound herself. Eh bien, I saw at once that there was no fake. The cords had actually been drawn so tight as to cut into the flesh. That ruled out the possibility of her having committed the crime single-handed. But it was still possible for her to have connived at it, or to have been the instigator with an accomplice. Moreover, the story, as she told it, was singularly familiar to me. The masked men that she could not recognize, the mention of the secret, I had heard, or read, all these things before. Another little detail confirmed my belief that she was not speaking the truth. The wristwatch, Hastings, the wristwatch. Again that wristwatch. Poirot was eyeing me curiously. "You see, mon ami? You comprehend?" "No," I replied with some ill humor. "I neither see nor comprehend. You make all these confounded mysteries, and it's useless asking you to explain. You always like keeping something up your sleeve to the last minute." "Do not enrage yourself, my friend," said Poirot, with a smile. "I will explain if you wish. But not a word to Giraud, c'est entendu? He treats me as an old one of no importance. We shall see." In common fairness I gave him a hint. If he does not choose to act upon it, that is his own lookout. I assured Poirot that he could rely upon my discretion. "C'est bien. Let us then employ our little grey cells. Tell me, my friend, at what time, according to you, did the tragedy take place?" "Why, at 2 o'clock or thereabouts," I said, astonished. "You remember, Mrs. Renaud told us that she heard the clock strike while the men were in the room." "Exactly, and on the strength of that, you, the examining magistrate, Bex, and everyone else, accept the time without further question. But I, Hercule Poirot, say that Madame Renaud lied. The crime took place at least 2 hours earlier." "But the doctors?" "They declared, after examination of the body, that death had taken place between 10 and 7 hours previously. Mon ami, For some reason it was imperative that the crime should seem to have taken place later than it actually did. You have read of a smashed watch or clock recording the exact hour of a crime? So that the time should not rest on Madame Renaud's testimony alone, someone moved on the hands of that wristwatch to 2 o'clock, and then dashed it violently to the ground. But, as is often the case, they defeated their own object. The glass was smashed, but the mechanism of the watch was uninjured. It was a most disastrous maneuver on their part, for it at once drew my attention to 2 points. First, that Madame Renaud was lying. Secondly, that there must be some vital reason for the postponement of the time. But what reason could there be? Ah, that is the question. There we have the whole mystery. As yet, I cannot explain it. There is only one idea that presents itself to me as having a possible connection. And that is? The last train left Merlinville at 17 minutes past 12. I followed it out slowly. So that, the crime apparently taking place some 2 hours later, anyone leaving by that train would have an unimpeachable alibi. Perfect, Hastings. You have it. I sprang up. But we must inquire at the station. Surely they cannot have failed to notice 2 foreigners who left by that train. We must go there at once. You think so, Hastings? Of course. Let us go there now. Poirot restrained my ardor with a light touch upon the arm. Go by all means if you wish, mon ami, but if you go, I should not ask for particulars of 2 foreigners. I stared, and he said rather impatiently, La, you do not believe all that rigmarole, do you? The masked men and all the rest of cette histoire-là. His words took me so much aback, that I hardly knew how to respond. He went on serenely. You heard me say to Giraud, did you not, that all the details of this crime were familiar to me? Eh bien, that presupposes one of 2 things, either the brain that planned the first crime also planned this one, or else an account read of a cause célèbre unconsciously remained in our assassin's memory and prompted the details. I shall be able to pronounce definitely on that after. He broke off. I was revolving sundry matters in my mind. But Mr. Renaud's letter? It distinctly mentions a secret and Santiago. Undoubtedly there was a secret in Monsieur Renaud's life, there can be no doubt of that. On the other hand, the word Santiago, to my mind, is a red herring, dragged continually across the track to put us off the scent. It is possible that it was used in the same way on Monsieur Renaud, to keep him from directing his suspicions to a quarter nearer at hand. Oh, be assured, Hastings, the danger that threatened him was not in Santiago, it was near at hand, in France. He spoke so gravely, and with such assurance, that I could not fail to be convinced. But I essayed one final objection. And the match and cigarette end found near the body? What of them? A light of pure enjoyment lit up Poirot's face. Deliberately planted there for Giraud or one of his tribe to find. Ah, he is smart, Giraud, he can do his tricks. So can a good retriever dog. He comes in so pleased with himself. For hours he has crawled on his stomach. See what I have found, he says. And then again to me, what do you see here? Me, I answer, with profound and deep truth, nothing. And Giraud, the great Giraud, he laughs, he thinks to himself, oh, he is imbecile, this old one. But we shall see. But my mind had reverted to the main facts. Then all this story of the masked men is false. What really happened? Poirot shrugged his shoulders. One person could tell us, Madame Renaud. But she will not speak. Threats and entreaties would not move her. A remarkable woman that, Hastings. I recognized as soon as I saw her that I had to deal with a woman of unusual character. At first, as I told you, I was inclined to suspect her of being concerned in the crime. Afterwards I altered my opinion. What made you do that? Her spontaneous and genuine grief at the sight of her husband's body. I could swear that the agony in that cry of hers was genuine. Yes, I said thoughtfully, one cannot mistake these things. I beg your pardon, my friend, one can always be mistaken. Regard a great actress, Does not our acting of grief carry you away and impress you with its reality? No, however strong my own impression and belief, I needed other evidence before I allowed myself to be satisfied. The great criminal can be a great actor. I base my certainty in this case not upon my own impression, but upon the undeniable fact that Madame Renaud actually fainted. I turned up her eyelids and felt her pulse. There was no deception, the swoon was genuine. Therefore I was satisfied that her anguish was real and not assumed. Besides, a small additional point without interest, it was unnecessary for Madame Renaud to exhibit unrestrained grief. She had had one paroxysm on learning of her husband's death, and there would be no need for her to simulate another such a violent one on beholding his body. No, Madame Renaud was not her husband's murderess. But why has she lied? She lied about the wristwatch, she lied about the masked men, she lied about a third thing. Tell me, Hastings, what is your explanation of the open door? Well, I said, rather embarrassed, I suppose it was an oversight. They forgot to shut it. Poirot shook his head and sighed. That is the explanation of Giraud. It does not satisfy me. There is a meaning behind that open door which for the moment I cannot fathom. One thing I am fairly sure of, they did not leave through the door. They left by the window. What? Precisely. But there were no footmarks in the flower bed underneath. No, and there ought to have been. Listen, Hastings. The gardener, Auguste, as you heard him say, planted both those beds the preceding afternoon. In the one there are plentiful impressions of his big hobnailed boots, in the other, none. You see? Someone had passed that way, someone who, to obliterate their footprints, smoothed over the surface of the bed with a rake. Where did they get a rake? Where they got the spade and the gardening gloves, said Poirot impatiently. There is no difficulty about that. What makes you think that they left that way, though? Surely it is more probable that they entered by the window, and left by the door? That is possible, of course. Yet I have a strong idea that they left by the window. I think you are wrong. Perhaps, mon ami. I mused, thinking over the new field of conjecture that Poirot's deductions had opened up to me. I recalled my wonder at his cryptic allusion to the flower bed and the wristwatch. His remarks had seemed so meaningless at the moment, and now, for the first time, I realized how remarkably, from a few slight incidents, he had unraveled much of the mystery that surrounded the case. I paid a belated homage to my friend. In the meantime, I said, considering, although we know a great deal more than we did, we are no nearer to solving the mystery of who killed Mr. Renaud. No, said Poirot cheerfully. In fact, we are a great deal farther off. The fact seemed to afford him such peculiar satisfaction that I gazed at him in wonder. He met my eye and smiled. Suddenly a light burst upon me. Poirot. Mrs. Renaud. I see it now. She must be shielding somebody. From the quietness with which Poirot received my remark, I could see that the idea had already occurred to him. Yes, he said thoughtfully. Shielding someone, or screening someone. One of the two. Then, as we entered our hotel, he enjoined silence on me with a gesture. Chapter 13 The Girl with the Anxious Eyes. We lunched with an excellent appetite. For a while we ate in silence, and then Poirot observed maliciously, "Eh bien. And your indiscretions? You recount them not?" I felt myself blushing. "Oh, you mean this morning?" I endeavored to adopt a tone of absolute nonchalance. But I was no match for Poirot. In a very few minutes he had extracted the whole story from me, his eyes twinkling as he did so. Tn. A story of the most romantic. What is her name, this charming young lady? I had to confess that I did not know. Still more romantic. The first rencontre in the train from Paris, the second here. Journeys end in lovers' meetings, is not that the saying? Don't be an ass, Poirot. Yesterday it was Mademoiselle d'Aubroil, today it is Mademoiselle Cinderella. Decidedly you have the heart of a Turk, Hastings. You should establish a harem. It's all very well to rag me. Mademoiselle d'Aubroil is a very beautiful girl, and I do admire her immensely, I don't mind admitting it. The others nothing, I don't suppose I shall ever see her again. You do not propose to see the lady again? His last words were almost a question, and I was aware of the sharpness with which he darted a glance at me. And before my eyes, writ large in letters of fire, I saw the words Hôtel du Fer, and I heard again her voice saying, "Come and look me up," and my own answering with empressement, "I will." I answered Poirot lightly enough. She asked me to look her up, but, of course, I shan't. Why of course? Well, I don't want to. Mademoiselle Cinderella is staying at the Hôtel d'Angleterre, you told me, did you not? No. Hôtel du Fer. True, I forgot. A moment's misgiving shot across my mind. Surely I had never mentioned any hotel to Poirot. I looked across at him and felt reassured. He was cutting his bread into neat little squares, completely absorbed in his task. He must have fancied I had told him where the girl was staying. We had coffee outside facing the sea. Poirot smoked one of his tiny cigarettes, and then drew his watch from his pocket. "The train to Paris leaves at 2:25, he observed. "I should be starting." "Paris?" I cried. "That is what I said, mon ami." "You are going to Paris? But why?" He replied very seriously. "To look for the murderer of Monsieur Renauld." "You think he is in Paris?" "I am quite certain that he is not. Nevertheless, it is there that I must look for him. You do not understand, but I will explain it all to you in good time. Believe me, this journey to Paris is necessary. I shall not be away long. In all probability I shall return tomorrow. I do not propose that you should accompany me. Remain here and keep an eye on Giraud. Also cultivate the society of Monsieur Renauld Fils." "That reminds me," I said. "I meant to ask you how you knew about those two." Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.